And we're back for episode 27 of Pursuing the Perfect Pint podcast. And this week, I think everyone is going to be hooked on this podcast, Brent, because it's a topic that is still so much in the market, still front of everybody's mind. It's really about energy markets, transformations, and all the disruptions that we continue to see.
Yeah, and yeah, so we'll get to Katrien and her feedback, which she's now spoke at 3 events, and it's always good feedback because she just has a great way of putting it all in a very succinct manner. But maybe before we get there, I guess episode 27, the market element of it is probably 2 things today, Danielle. There's my usual weather update, but then I guess what everyone will hear very shortly from Katrien is we just passed the 100th day of the U.S.-Iran crisis. So this whole idea that this was going to be short-lived, that's definitely not happened. So these disruptions continue, and we'll hear more about that. Bring it closer to the world of malt and malting barley. We've seen weather improvements almost everywhere because it's rained in Europe, it's rained in North America, it's rained in Australia. So here's my weather report. But generally, I think we're in a good place from crop 26, which is going to start to harvest very soon in France from a winter barley perspective. I think anyone listening to this can take away, the key takeaway would be, it would seem at the moment there's not going to be any major surprises that are going to disrupt the grain markets and therefore barley. So you could look ahead to 2027. It's probably going to be quite normal in terms of the world of malt will be fairly benign. So, which is probably welcome. We don't need any more inflationary impact. So I think we could say the weather is progressed. The only 2 areas I would say are even minor watchouts is it's very wet in Argentina, so they need to get a crop planted yet. And Russia has been very wet and delayed, so their crop will be later than normal. But around the rest of the world, I'd say average to probably slightly above average would be the view today.
It's a much more positive outlook. And I think, Brent, let's hear then maybe from Katrien herself on her thoughts on the energy markets and where we might be looking as we will head to days 101 plus on the energy crisis.
As we often say, just fasten your seatbelts and listen, because this is a good ride here. Okay, well, the pursuit of the perfect pint is going to take a little bit of a journey into something we wouldn't normally cover, but this is related. We will bring it back to beer. But Katrien Even is here from Power Pulse, and you'll explain a bit more. But I guess, first of all, Katrien, thanks for taking some time. You're part of I kind of feel like you're part of the RMI team because you've been at 3 of our last global conferences and very well received. So thanks again for that. Thanks again for taking some time today. Maybe we could start a little bit of introduction of.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for the invitation, Brent. So PowerPulse is a Belgian-based consultancy firm with a focus on energy. So we are providing market intelligence to our clients. Our clients are energy intensive consumers in the Western European market. So we also have quite a lot of breweries as our clients, as energy is also an important topic for them. And so on a day-to-day basis, we are providing advice. When would you buy power, gas? What's happening in the market? How will it affect your budget? What about decarbonization? What are the trends? What are the most intelligent things to do? So that's what we do. And so the company was founded 12 years ago. And hopefully we will remain in the market for quite a while.
Yeah. Well, I joked about it when we just recently met in Lisbon. The first time we met was in March of 2022, and that was 1 month after Russia and the Ukraine crisis erupted. And now we recently met in Lisbon, and it was right around the time of the events starting in Iran. So I guess we're in the midst of what I've called the 6 most disruptive years that we will ever face in our career, hopefully, I guess. And in your work, the energy market has been at the forefront of that. I guess you could talk a little bit about the wild journey we've been on and kind of where you see things currently.
Yeah, it seems that we are moving from crisis to crisis, and every time we meet, Brent, it's getting worse. So hopefully next time we can talk about something else. But yeah, the last 5 years have been quite rough for the energy markets, and of course, I think the Ukrainian crisis was already very disruptive for the market. But if we put it in a global perspective, and the crisis, the Middle East crisis that we are currently facing in volumes and figures is even worse. And of course, the Russia-Ukrainian crisis was with a very strong focus on gas, but now I think the oil crisis is even bigger than the gas crisis, and we do not immediately see a solution for the conflict. I think when we met in Lisbon, I think the conflict started beginning of March, and we met end of March, and then a lot of bad things also happened to the infrastructure in Ras Laffan from the Qatari, where like 20% of their production was damaged by an Iranian attack. If we look now, approximately 2 months later, I think we are still facing major problems with the Strait of Hormuz that sometimes gives access to a couple of cargoes, but there is no structural solution in the making yet. And for me, one of the key messages is because a lot of analysts are focusing, when will it reopen? How long can we put a bet on it? Will it be 2 months, 3 months? And how will it affect the price? But I think there's a very nice quote coming from the chairman of the International Energy Agency saying that you can compare it with a broken vase. You can try to put the pieces together, you can try to fix it, but you will still see the cracks. And that's exactly the same with this crisis. Even if we come to a kind of solution between the US, Israel, and Iran, Iran has tasted the power they have with the Strait of Hormuz. And so there will be quite a lot of confidence from the global markets in that area, and the market will always be very reluctant because it can happen again. Iran can decide tomorrow that they will close the Strait of Hormuz again. And also the fate in the reliability of the production of LNG in the Middle East region, it's really in decline. So for me, there is really a before and an after. Even if we can resolve it, it will probably have a permanent effect on the global energy markets. And it's very important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's different, as you say. I guess if I tried to relate it back and thinking back to the Russia-Ukraine situation, that was very impactful to Western Europe when you talked about the gas supply got interrupted. And I think if I bring it back to the world of brewing and malting, a lot of maltsters and brewers, I guess in that way, they had to think about alternative backup systems because they couldn't rely on natural gas necessarily, and they've built all that. So it's in a much better place today than it was then, but that's 4 years later. So I guess a bit of what you're talking about is whatever the result is when this thing normalizes, whatever that means, it won't be exactly the same as it was before. And as you just said, the risk doesn't go away entirely. So this could be just different more than there's no immediate negotiation, a peace deal, and things go back 100% to where they were. It's likely always going to be different. Is that a fair summary of kind of how you see it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and that's especially for Europe, and you're right, during the crisis in 2022, it was mainly Europe being affected, and in a second wave also the Asian markets, because there was a very fierce competition between Europe and Asia to get the replacement gas, and Europe was able to pay more for it. Now we see that Asia is even more affected, mainly for oil. It's even worse than for gas. But I think what's really a point of attention for Europe is the dependency debate, because we learned a very tough lesson with Russia. But now we tend to end up in the same situation, but this time it's with a very high dependency on US LNG, and there is always a risk that it will be weaponized, because of course the US do not really suffer. Of course, they're also suffering high inflation rates and they also have their problems, but they are less impacted by the Middle East crisis because they're the biggest producer of oil and gas in the world. So they're in quite a strong position, and they're becoming a very, very strong petrol state, and they can definitely use this against Europe. So I think Europe needs to think about what's next and how can we diversify our energy mix and how can we become less dependent from countries abroad, because you never know if there is a regime change or whatever. It can have a huge effect, and we don't want our industries, our breweries, being completely dependent from the will of some politicians that change their mind overnight. I think that's a big risk.
Yeah. And if we took it then, taking the same kind of lens and apply it to current situation, different part of the world is more impacted on the current Strait of Hormuz. If you thought about Southeast Asia, and what we follow a lot is Australia. So we talk a lot Australian agriculture is very concerned about where their fertilizer is going to come from, or what's the price of that fertilizer going to be, because it is very directly related to natural gas or LNG. So different parts of the world, they're impacted differently, of course, and I guess depending where you are, you feel different impacts. So I guess this time around, maybe a greater impact on places like Southeast Asia and Australia. They will do the same, I think, in terms of thinking of what they could do differently to diversify the same approach and so on. I guess those things will take some time as well. I guess we don't have Katrien, we don't have a crystal ball, so we can't predict on what day this is all going to end. So I guess what we could talk about is what are the things to be thinking about? And you mentioned it in prepping for this. What are some of the more macro trends that are taking place that people should keep in mind if they're listening to this? So there is the ongoing immediate crises, plural, but beyond that, we will move forward one way or another. And what are those trends as you see it, those mega trends, if I call it that?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. And then you see that the world is getting a little bit more divided into the so-called petrostates and the electrostates. And we already saw this after the Ukrainian crisis, but we see it even more now. And especially, as you mentioned, Asia. So they have been heavily affected because they import like 40% of their oil from areas after the Strait of Hormuz. First of all, we saw a lot of rationing. Really took very fierce measures to reduce demand, closure of schools, things like that. But what we see now, and that's actually a very interesting trend, is that there is really an acceleration of electrification. In most of these countries, we see that huge subsidy schemes are being developed by countries like Thailand, Bangladesh, Pakistan. So they're investing a lot in solar production. And I think it's for Pakistan, they were able to avoid $12 billion import of LNG because they were able to replace it by solar production. And it's a general trend. And of course, the most important country in this story is China. Because if you look at clean tech development, and I think there is no way back, clean tech is the way forward, and electrification is probably the best the option to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. And you see that China, as a country, is producing more clean tech than the rest of the world together. So it's huge. Just to give you a number, in March 2026, they exported solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles for a total value of almost 22 billion just during 1 month. So they're the biggest factory of solar panels, batteries in the world. And it comes with an advantage because we also see a very positive impact on price. If you compare the price of a solar panel in 2022 and now, it dropped by 75%. For batteries, it's minus 40%. So it's definitely creating opportunities for end consumers to make the investment. I think one important point of concern is, of course, that China is the mega factory of all these technologies, and especially in Europe, but I think it also counts for Australia. We need to be very, very careful and also trying to build up. We do have the knowledge, that's not a problem, but it's more that we cannot produce it at the same cost as what they are doing in China. But also there we need to become more independent from clean tech imports from China, because if one day there is a conflict and we do not get the assets anymore, then we end up in the same situation. But I would say there is a silver lining in this crisis, that we see this huge boost of electrification in all these countries, and there is no way back. They will keep on investing and reducing their dependency on fossil fuels, and I think that's only positive to see that happening.
And you had said, as we also prep for this, you've been quite impressed at the speed of that transformation to the electrification, that it's gone, fair to say, gone faster than you could have even imagined, or what most people would have thought. It's really accelerated, which is good to see. Maybe China's position is quite strong, but they're certainly helping facilitate that change. It will come with maybe some challenges given their market position going forward, but they're definitely facilitating that expansion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we should also, as a European continent, getting some inspiration from countries that you would not even expect. Like I think in Vietnam, they're going to electrify 120 million motorcycles. Ethiopia, they have a ban on fossil fuel cars. In Europe, we have been very reluctant, and we extended the deadline once again. And so we are a little bit being surpassed by other regions and countries in the world that are daring to take very firm strategic decisions. So it's very interesting to see that trend, that even the emerging countries are really getting up to speed and are even going much faster than Europe has done over the last couple of years. And for me, that's an important wake-up call if we want to keep our industry and offer them competitive prices, competitive energy prices. Then we really need to make sure that we move now and that we do something instead of waiting and being surpassed by all the other regions in the world.
Yeah, and at the same time, you talked about the petro-focused countries. So you take, I think your example was the U.S. So I guess given everything you just described, the U.S. has actually gone, I guess, the other direction, if I say it that way, in terms of more back to fossil fuel-based focus.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, if you look at their climate ambitions, they have been reduced heavily since President Trump is in the Oval Office. But even if you look at the value, and of course, the US is an important player. They are the biggest producer of oil and gas, so they have quite dominant position in the world. But also, if you put the figures next to each other, if you look at the total export value of the US, that's being also outpaced by what China is currently exporting. If you look at the revenues they're getting from their clean tech export, it's already much higher than the revenues from the US with their fossil products. So I think it's a very tricky strategic decision that is made by the US. And sometimes it's very symbolic. A couple of months ago, they paid Total. Total was looking into the development of a very, very large offshore wind park, and they were getting paid by the Trump administration to step out of the project and to reinvest the money in refinery business. So I think on the longer term that the US is taking a very high risk, because I don't think that the rest of the world is wrong by following the path of electrification and investing in a greener economy. But we will see in a couple of years how it plays out, but I think it's a very riskful strategy on the longer term.
Yeah, and it's almost as simple, what you're just described, Katrien, is it's kind of a value add versus the raw material kind of approach. So the U.S. is selling the fuels, but the Chinese are taking that energy and converting it into a value add, batteries and solar panels and EVs and so on. So yeah, and of course the Chinese take a very long-term view to things. So you can see where they will be doing that much longer than the next 2 years, I guess would be a fair conclusion in where they're going. So maybe the other related topic, I guess sustainability and decarbonization is a natural byproduct of what you described for those parts of the world that are really moving on their electrification, because they would be carbon reduction would come along with that. It's a big focus in the brewing industry, as you know, and what we talked about in Lisbon. I guess that's another big mega trend, I guess, if I call it that, the decarbonization. And where do you see that in the energy?
Well, what we have seen, at least just when the crisis in Ukraine started, we saw actually quite an important boost of decarbonization investments, because it was seen as kind of alternative for very expensive gas prices. But then in the last 2 years, of course, and then especially looking at Europe, there is this lack of competitiveness. If you compare our energy costs, especially with the US, but also with China, our companies are paying much more, and especially in the segment where we see the activities of the breweries, they're big consumers, but they're not like the huge chemical companies that are usually getting a little bit more shielding from the government. So they're actually in quite a vulnerable position. And what we have seen lately is that decarbonization, there is still a very, very strong willingness to decarbonize. But on the other hand, a lot of industries are trying to protect their core business, because they are trying just to compete with competitors in other regions with much lower energy prices. So you see that the focus is currently more on surviving the next couple of years. Although we still see that a lot of our clients, also in the brewery sector, are still taking a lot of initiatives, especially in scope 1 and 2, to reduce their emissions. So it's not that they do not care about decarbonization. It's the other way around. There is still a very strong focus, but we do see a slowdown at the moment, because you can use your euro only once, and a lot of companies are trying to protect their core business. What's also a very important topic, I think, on the European agenda, because of course decarbonization, most of the initiatives come from the industry itself, but you also have regulation that has quite an important impact on what is happening. And it's a very big debate in Europe because the industry has been complaining that the ETS, the emission scheme in Europe, is actually quite it's a burden for the industry. So there is this ongoing debate. Do we need to change the system? Do we give a little bit more flexibility? And I think the key message there is the European industry, they need to buy their EUAs in the market because they are ETS compliant. But currently, only 10% of the total budget is going back to the industry, which doesn't make sense because it makes it a tax. While if Europe would make a reform where a lot of that money goes back to the industry and they can use it to make decarbonization investments, it probably will go much, much quicker. So there are probably so we are hoping because in July, the reforms will come on the table from the European Commission and they will have to take some decisions. And we hope that they will take some intelligent decisions that can give an additional support to the European industry to continue their decarbonization initiatives because they are definitely there.
Yeah. Well, it all leads to, and I guess everyone has budgets and even consumers have budgets. And we've seen that in lower beer volumes. And I guess I think that's the point you made a bit earlier around survival. I think it's not a great strategy, but I guess everyone's dealt with the reality. You have to survive. It's kind of a shame that those investments can't be accelerated, but there's certain limits. Beer, we don't really need the inflation. As I've talked about, we do have the price of beer has been impacted to the upside and it's got more expensive for consumers. When you look at the market now, it's hard to think of a lot of relief in the immediate term because we have these crises going on, which is going to also slow down any kind of beer volume recovery. So I guess we'll have to stay tuned for that. And we'll probably have to have a follow-up episode with you because, tomorrow something else will happen and we'll have another topic. But maybe to wrap up, Katrien, you're in Belgium, very big beer part of the world, and Pursuit of the Perfect Pint podcast would ask, when you look at it with your lens from a Belgian perspective, what does the perfect pint potentially look like in your mind?
Well, that's a good question. It should be an affordable pint. I think that's important that we keep focus on the price. Ideally, it should be a green pint. And if I look at the Belgian market, I think our Belgian brewers are actually performing quite well on that area. So a lot of initiatives have been taken. And of course, it's all about taste. And I'm a little bit privileged, of course, because I'm living very close to a few very large breweries. So I think if we can keep the quality of our Belgian beer at an affordable price, then I think we're good to go for the next year. So no complaints from my side on that topic, to be honest.
Yeah, no, well, good. And I think, as you said, brewers have done a lot. There's a lot more that can be done, but maybe your point is there's lots to be learned from the Belgian brewers and all the things they've done already to go forward. So we can recommend anyone in the Antwerp area, if they need a recommendation, we can get something from Katrien. So Katrien, thanks again for all your wonderful insights. We'll keep in touch. We may need to update once things hopefully change in the weeks and months ahead. But until then, thanks again, and we'll chat soon.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Oh, Brent, that was certainly an action-packed listen. And I think the interesting thing there is we can't fix a broken vase. So even if the crisis does end, there's going to be some longer-term structural changes in what we're seeing in the energy markets.
Yeah. Well, I had joked with Katrien in preparing. I was starting to get a bit of a complex because every time we're getting ready for a RMI event, we have these big things. I hope she's right that when we get to our next big event, things have settled down a lot. But I think she was really good, and I think her way of expressing it is great because we all have a bit of an understanding, of course, but putting it in the right context. So the differences between what's going on now and what happened back when the Russia-Ukraine flared up, much different in different parts of the world. And I think that's if I had to say another key message for people is it's less impactful from an actual supply perspective in Europe now, and it's a bigger problem in Southeast Asia and Australia, just in terms of physical supply. The the price action is also crazy, and that's where markets are very, very quick to arbitrage, and risk premiums get built in and all that. But in terms of physical supply disruption, it's really shifted to Southeast Asia and Australia, and that was one big message for me. And I guess if I just summarized that whole topic around China feeding into Southeast Asia, and some of the examples in Asia in general, just the electrification of some of these markets,
The
and
scale and pace, incredible.
yeah, light speed, and you've got other big markets are still in, if you say, a different view, which is more on the petro side of it. So very interesting how this all balances going ahead, but some great insights from Katrien, and that's why her feedback is always, the feedback about her is always so good at our events, that people can expect to see her again for sure.
Yeah, I think look forward to it. And probably good to have her back on the podcast in a few months' time, when we see the next, however this thing is going to evolve.
Yeah, for sure.
And Brent, looking forward to a chat next week. Where are we headed in the world next?
Well, in the next weeks, we've back to the UK. So I took a short trip over and visited the UK, primarily to see how that barley crop was looking,
Yeah.
and it has a few challenges, but also took some time to connect with some farmers and with a brewer. So we got some UK and also a trip back to North America, and a bit of a conversation about Canada. So I guess next week it will be the UK, but upcoming you could think about UK and then on to Canada.
Looking forward to it. Cheers, Brent.
Cheers.